Well, we're very grateful that, like students at Augustana have learned for a couple of decades now, since 1991, there are great lecturers on Joyce, and then there are truly sublime lecturers on Joyce. I think you'll find he's in the latter category. Please join me in welcoming Professor Joe McDowell.
Well, thank you, Kai, and thank you all. You made me sound a lot better than I am, actually. And if there are any very old Welsh people in here, come up and talk to me afterwards. Let me see if I can get this back up here. It's not happening. Wait, here we go.
Oh,
Got it. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. I was asked, what is the greatest book? And Tweet asked this question all the time, and he was just a provocateur, right? He was not. He didn't really want an answer. What he wanted you to do is to defend what it means to be a great book and so on. And as Kai intimated, he would change his own mind quite often. He was a rascal, was Roll's Tweet. I want to tell you about how the first time I met him, before I start talking about Joyce. It was at my interview for the job at Augustana. And there were 3 faculty members there, Don Erickson, party member, and Roll Tweet. Many of you know any of the personalities at Augustana. And at one point, Don Erickson said, well, I can see that you're a medievalist, but at a small college, we often have to wear other hats. Could you, for example, if you had to, at the last minute, teach a class in romantic poetry? And after hesitating for a second or two, I said, frankly, I can teach anything I can read. And that was just enough cockiness to delight Roll Tweet. And that, I think that I owe my job at Augustana for that lapse, that momentary youthful lapse that so delighted our Dr. Tweet. So I'm happy to do this here in part to honor Dr. Tweet. Okay, the other story I'll tell you, my wife was reminding me, she was one of his students, and she said that one year in an American Lit class, he said, you can either take your points for your final grade, or you can take your grade on your final paper and substitute that, and that will be your grade for the class. So she did that. The week after classes were over, she got her paper back, and it had an A- and 1 comment. Nobody's perfect. That was her one comment, his one comment on her paper. So she said at the time, she didn't really appreciate that, but now she finds it amusing and adorable, and so on. So, all right, I got up here a quote from Joyce, where he says, I put in so many enigmas and puzzles that it will keep the professors busy for centuries, arguing over what I meant. And I think that's a good starting point to talk about why I think Ulysses is one of the most important books in the English language. It is partly based on the Odyssey. So if you look over there in that back corner, you'll see next week's speaker, a professor of classics who is going to talk about the Odyssey. And we had kind of hoped that she would go first, and then there was some conflict. But if you're here next week, you can try to make those connections. So one of the things that he did, not alone, Virginia Woolf did this too, and I could easily have picked Virginia Woolf instead of James Joyce for this honor. But one of the things he did is he challenged the form of the novel. Novels before him, think of Charles Dickens, tended to be linear, chronological, focused on a single hero who had a conflict, resolved it, and then there's a denouement, and everything's wrapped up, all the loose ties are retied, or loose strings are tied. But he gives us 3 protagonists in this novel. Stephen Dedalus, the protagonist of the first 3 chapters, is.
Can I just chip one button on this and make it bigger?
Okay, thank you. that better? Okay, sorry. Thanks. By the way, Kai was saying that I can save questions for the end, or I can just invite you to just ask questions as they occur to you, and I'm willing to do that. If you do have a question as I'm talking, just raise your hand. We'll treat it like a class, you know, and so on. So Stephen McDowell is the hero of his prior novel called Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And so he is the star of the first 3 chapters, and then he goes away and we move to an entirely new guy, Leopold Bloom. And then Leopold Bloom's wife, Molly, has a monologue, which is the 18th and last chapter. So it is challenging the form of what novels are supposed to do, how they're supposed to work. All right? The other thing is that he relates the very specific details of a single day in Leopold Bloom's life. It's a 24-hour period, June 16th, 1904. June 16th in Ireland is called Bloomsday, and people walk around the city recreating the journey of Leopold Bloom through Dublin every June 16th. So something of kind of a superhero in the Irish imagination. So, but they're very everyday details. He doesn't have some big conflict he's going to solve. He goes to the Turkish baths and takes a bath. He has breakfast in the morning and ends his first chapter, chapter 4, by going to the outhouse and having a bout with him. I mean, these are just the details of an everyday person and doing, following their everyday life. So it's another way that he changes the form of the novel. Leopold Bloom is half Jewish on his father's side. Let me see, I have more notes here. Most of the novel is related through Bloom's consciousness. It's not even actions that he's taking, but just him thinking his way through town. So it's called stream of consciousness style. And one of the preoccupations of his life is the death of his son, Rudolph, when he was 11 years old. Since the death of his son, he and his wife had not had marital relations. And he is in many ways looking for a son. He's a father looking for a son. Stephen McDowell is a son looking for a father. And they come together in chapter 17 and kind of enact that role. And it also, 2 other literary motifs that pop up in the novel often are also related to fathers and sons. Hamlet and the Odyssey with Telemachus and Ulysses. So that whole idea of father and son is one of the lasting themes in the novel. All right. He's also beginning an epistolary affair with a woman in Dublin named Martha. He's never met her. They've begun to exchange letters. And so another, I guess you call it literary, but musical reference that happens in the novel is Watteau's opera called Martha. And there are references to that, quotations from that, music in the background from that opera that pervade the novel as well. So it leads me to my next point, which is how he challenges the techniques. Is that big enough for you to see? Is that okay? All right. He challenges the techniques of novel writing too. He uses, for example, music, film, a closet drama, and a working newspaper room. Every chapter is written in a different style. You can see from chapter 10, which is called Wandering Rocks, there are 11 separate characters progressing through the town of Dublin in 10 different locations simultaneously. So that the only way you could imagine that would be filming that from up above, so that you can see the different paths as they are wandering around through the city of Dublin. he was an early proponent of film. Films were just getting started in the early 20th century. And he was really excited about the potential there. Music has been a part of his life. He came in second in the All-Ireland singing competition. Very few people know that. And so music is in all of his works. But in this one, I'm going to show you an example in a minute of a chapter that is entirely written in the musical form called a fugue. Kai might be able to enlighten us on that more than I can. But a fugue is a piece where a motif or a melody flies from one voice to another. Is that about right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And so I'll show you an example in a minute of how he works that out. And Ulysses, the Ulysses chapter takes place in the newspaper offices, and they go around from room to room, but almost the entire chapter is headlines that you would find in the newspapers of the time. Let me show you, I think. Okay, so here we go. There is this chapter, the Sirens chapter, takes place in a hotel bar. And there are a number of the main characters in the novel, people that we're already familiar with before we get there. This is chapter 11. And some of the men are standing around the piano, taking turns playing the piano and then singing familiar songs. Some of them from the opera Martha, the other ones a traditional Irish folk song. And there is a chord that you can see where he uses parts of Simon, Lionel, and Leopold to make one. I always do this when I'm thinking about this, because I'm imagining playing a chord on a piano, right? 1, 3, 5. And there's a trill for wavy, wavy, heavy, wavy, heavy, air on tone, right? So it's like the trill on a piano. And there's an introduction. Kai, can you make it big again?
I don't know if I can within the slide. You can try.
Like Control plus.
Yeah, there you go. You zoomed in.
Okay.
You just want to move around within it.
So, I'm sorry for how small this is. But this is the very beginning of the Sirens chapter. I don't know how well you can see that. But this is how it begins. It begins with all the words on the left. And then I put in, after the hyphen, I put in what they refer to. So you have whatever that first word, that first selection of words, that's the deaf waiter Pat. He can't speak that clearly because he is deaf. And so that's how, he's trying to say impertinence, but that's how he does it. Chips, picking chips off rocky thumbnail chips is an indication of Simon Dedalus. I like to think of this as Peter and the Wolf, where when the bassoon comes in, it's one particular animal and so on. And that's how he plays this, is he uses these phrases. Gold and bronze are the two waitresses at the bar, and so on. So when it says pink cried to bronze in pity, then somebody is talking to Mrs. Kennedy, who is one of the waitresses there, and so on. All right, so anyway, it's amazing and so difficult to read this. It's chapter 11. This is where people give up. So how many people have actually read Ulysses? You have. 2 of you have. Yes. Very few people have. I know English professors who, about every other summer, say, this is the year I'm going to finish Ulysses. And they get to chapter 11 and then they're done. Yeah. So it's one of the things that makes it difficult, but it's also one of the things that makes it a really interesting experiment in how to break free of what the old novel that he's trying to replace, the novel which he thinks tells a curtailed and artificial story about human life, right? And so it's one of the reasons why I tell my students at the beginning of my Joyce class that if they make it through, whatever grade they get, they're going to join a small group of people who have actually finished Ulysses. Right? So, and you can see that this is one of the reasons why.
A smaller group finished filling its weight.
Yeah, that's right. I wanted to bring you another thing, another chart, and show you some of the complexity of the book. This is a scheme that Joyce himself wrote out when an Italian professor named Renati asked him about the structure of the novel, and especially how it ties into the Odyssey. Oh, I'm blocking myself. And he wrote this out. So for every chapter, the titles of the chapters, if you look in the book, there are no titles. There's just 1, 2, 3, 4. But he's labeled them here for us. And so chapter 1, for example, is Telemachus. And he has written what he says is going on there. For all of the different chapters, you can see that there's a technique, dialogue, peristaltic prose, that's wandering around, whirlpools, etc. There's an organ, and there are symbols. I'll just let you take a look at that for a second. You'll see how often Hamlet comes up or Shakespeare comes up. In, let's see. In Laestrygonians, Leopold Bloom has lunch. And it is still, you can go, it's the bar is still there where he has his lunch. And you can still go in and ask for the Leopold Bloom special, and they'll give it to you. It is Gorgonzola cheese on brown bread with strong English mustard and a glass of Burgundy. I get it every time I go, and I always get at least one student to go with me, and boy, is Gorgonzola cheese strong. I mean, one bite of it is one thing, but the whole sandwich made with that and strong English mustard is something else. And in Nausicaa, is that right? Interesting, close enough. Nausicaa, he does, I'll talk about Nausicaa and Oxen of the Sun in particular. Nausicaa, it's Leopold Bloom is on the beach, and he sees a young woman named Gertie McDowell, no relation. She knows that he's watching her, so she kind of hikes up her skirt a little bit so that he can see the bottom of her underwear. And he is standing behind her and masturbates while watching her. It's one of the reasons why Ulysses had such trouble getting published, is because of scenes like that, which they thought were indecent. Which in America, it took 10 years after it was finally published in Europe. It was almost 10 years before it could be published in America for that reason. But an interesting thing that he does there with the technique is that the first half of it is in her consciousness and is borrowed entirely from what the early 20th century version of Cosmopolitan. So all of the language is taken from those kinds of early magazines. He did his research. He went went and read them all. He used the kind of like how to please your man and how to set the table for a dinner party and how to remove blemishes from your skin and all the kinds of concerns that raise those novels. And the second half is in his consciousness, in Leopold Bloom's consciousness. So you have the female and male representatives of commentary on human heterosexual relationships. His being much cruder, hers being much more romantic. One thing that she says, my wife still says to me all the time, she talks about having brekkie with her hubby. And so my wife will say, hubby, do you want to have brekkie now? And it's just, she's making a reference to Joyce, so I allow it. It's pretty fun. At the end, by the way, the sacring bells from the mass going on in the church behind the beach, and Leopold Bloom's own finishing, and then an explosion of fireworks all happens at the same time. So, anyway, the next one, Oxen of the Sun, is interesting because it takes place in a maternity hospital where a woman introduced earlier named Mina Purefoy is in her 3rd day of labor, and she finally delivers the baby during this episode. But the episode itself begins in Latin and then goes through Old English and then Middle English and then Renaissance English, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and it develops through the prose of the entire history of the English language. So it is being, what do they call it, phylogenesis, where the embryo, human embryo goes through all the stages of human evolution. As it goes through something that looks a little bit like a shellfish or something like that, and it eventually becomes more and more like a primate, and eventually like a human being. And so that's how he writes that particular chapter. He takes us through the entire history of English prose. And then at the very end, just as the baby is being born, it breaks down into a crowd out in the street shouting insults. So the language falls apart. Right? It anticipates the philosopher and literary critic Derrida in some ways by understanding that language is not stable all the time. Language always is, can go a lot of different directions. I'm going to read something to you from his last book, Finnegan's Wake, in a few minutes at the end. So, the last thing I wanted to say, the last thing I think that we need to understand about James Joyce is that he's funny. He himself came up with the phrase, "Joko serious Joyce." Joko serious. So when he is being funny is when he really has something important and worthwhile to say. And so a lot of people, well, let me give you a couple of examples. Chapter 4, the first of the Leopold Bloom chapters, he's wandering around. He's actually on his way to a funeral. And he's wandering around and he says, then think of the competition. Let me see, maybe I have this up here. Yeah. Then think of the competition. General thirst. Good puzzle would be cross Dublin without passing a poem. Can you get from one side of Dublin to the other side of Dublin without passing a poem? For almost 100 years, maybe about 80 years, scholars worked on this problem. They got out maps, and now in the digital age, that's even easier to do, but they got out maps, and they tried to find a route. How can you get from one side to the other? Turns out it's a joke. How do you get from one side of Dublin to the other without passing a pub? You never pass the pub. You go in. You go into the pub, you have your pint, then you go back out, then you keep walking. And then the next pub, so there you go. You got all the way to the other side of Dublin, but you never passed the pub. It's a joke. Remember the quotation I began with? I put so many puzzles and enigmas in this book that it will keep the professors arguing, forever, or for 100 years or whatever. You're right. Finally, someone, a guy named David Joyce, figured out the answer to that question. And I'll tell you his story in a second here. He also has, in chapter 9, Leopold Bloom. It's a very curious guy. He's walking through the library, and it suddenly occurs to him to wonder whether the statues of the Greek goddesses actually have anuses. So he's caught by one of the other people trying to stare at the marble statues' buttocks to see if they have anuses, see if they're anatomically correct. And this makes the character who finds him doing that call him Greeker than the Greeks because of the no doubt libelous, scandalous idea that the Greeks were, at least the older men and the younger boys in the academy were practiced the love that they're not speaking name as that's why. So, all right. And then I'll tell you about the case of David Norris. David Norris is an Irish senator and also a Joyce scholar and just a raconteur, storyteller. He and Tweedler got along very well. They would have traded stories. So I was happy to be in Ireland during Blues Day one year, and David Norris was giving a talk about Joyce. And he shared the story of a couple of years earlier when they opened the Dublin Jewish Museum. The Dublin Jewish Museum was opened in a part of Dublin that had once been the Jewish center of town. The Jewish population had dissipated since then. But at the time, they bought a house and they dedicated it to Leopold Bloom, this Jewish character who is the most famous Irish hero. And so they had TV cameras out there, and David Norris was talking to the cameras. And while they were there, a neighbor came down the street wondering what was going on. And the TV camera started and said, "Hey, what do you think about this Leopold Bloom, the birthplace of Leopold Bloom, right here in your own neighborhood?" And he said, "Well, I can't say that I ever met the man himself, but sure didn't his mother come by my house every day and go buy her groceries." Now, this is a fictional character who, if he had lived in real life, would have lived 100 years ago. But he tells a story about how Leopold Bloom's mother still lives there and does her shopping every day, walks past her house. And so it kind of tells you the kind of institution that Joyce is and that Ulysses has in the Irish imagination. So, little tweet. I don't think you expect an answer to the best book ever. You only want to provoke more questions. And let me tell you this. Here's my final answer to you, little tweet. There is no solution. Seek it lovingly. Thank you. Any questions?
Did you have a suggestion for us that's not on the list?
I don't know. I
Other
don't
part of
remember.
the assignment.
Is that part of the assignment?
Well, if you have another suggestion, whether or not it's on the list.
Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf. I think they are the two leading lights of the early modernist movement. I remember once Karen Youngberg told me that Joyce would just be a footnote, and Virginia Woolf would be the real hero of the modern period. I don't agree with her, but I do think that Virginia Woolf belongs up there with Judy's story, so it's two leading lines.
Questions, please?
Yeah,
I have a very practical question.
sure.
So you had projected or displayed a couple charts. Please, can I have a paper copy of that?
Got one right here.
And that'd be great, the chart.
And then I can also get the entire thing to Pi and then distribute it, you know. Here's the paper copy of it. Slide here.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It pays to ask good questions.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I just came, I didn't sign up on time.
Okay.
Okay, you're out.
If not too many people have read this book, then why is it on the list? Why is it not on the list?
Well, because the experiments that he would do in these techniques were things that now a lot of people do. And even if they don't, it draws attention to the kind of artificial nature of the standard model before this, and that's good copy. And it's also, you know, how long would Harvard have to screw up before Harvard lost the reputation to be Harvard? You know, I mean, some ways this is reputation. Like, oh, I heard this is a really challenging book. Like, it's the reason I read War and Peace. It's the reason it took me an entire summer to read War and Peace, is because, you know, Tolstoy had a reputation for being one of the great novelists of all time.
Would you say that this is a difficult?
It's the most difficult novel I've read. I haven't read Infinite Jest yet, but by David Foster Wallace. But my son, who has read both, says that Infinite Jest is the modern American version of Joyce's Ulysses. In terms of the range of reference, you have to have an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the Catholic Church, in particular Thomistic theology, Irish legend, Greek and Roman legend, and modern day Dublin, just to get started. I mean, the depth of reference to other whole bodies, what we call intertextuality, is just immense. I mean, you can't believe any one brain knew all that stuff. But
How long did it take
to write it, he started in about 1914 and published it in 1922. So, and it was all three of his main books, Dubliners, Portrait of the Artist and the Young Man, and Ulysses, had publishing cards. He couldn't find publishers who were willing to take them on. Ulysses finally got published by a bookstore in Paris called Shakespeare Company, which is run by an American named Sylvia Beach, who, at her bookstore, had become kind of a salon for the exiled writers. You know, Hemingway was there, and Faulkner was there, Gertrude Stein was there, T.S. Eliot, and Beckett. Yeah. And so they all hung out there, and she finally took pity on it and said, "Okay, I'll publish it." And she wasn't really a publisher; she was a bookstore owner and a literary salon leader. And then it was, as I said, about I think it was 7 or 8 years, almost a decade before it got a real publisher in the U.S. So it was a struggle. Did I read for you something from his last book, Finnegan's Wake?
Please.
Yeah. I'm forgetting where I put my glasses. I've become my mother. My mother would walk on like, where are my glasses? I'm becoming that. So the beginning of Finnegan's Wake is a couple of spaces and then lowercase river run, comma, past even Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious ficus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. That's how it begins. Here's the trick. Old tree comments. go to the very last paragraph, it says, if I see him bearing down on me now under widespread wings, like he come from archangels, I sink, I dive down over his feet, humbly, dumbly, only to wash up. Yes, tide, there's where, first, we pass through grass to push the bush, wish a gull, gulls, far calls, coming far, and here, us then, fin again. Take us of the memory till thousands the lips, the keys to given away alone at last, beloved along the river run past even atoms of swerve of shore, etc. So the book goes in a big circle. And so the last, it ends in the middle of a sentence which is finished at the beginning. And it is one of the main characters in this particular book. This book is where language really falls apart, as you can probably tell from the nonsense I was reading, right? But one of the main characters in this book is a character called Anna Livia Plurabelle, which is the river, the main river that flows through Dublin. And so that's why it kind of goes in a circle, it circles back on itself. It's the endless flow of water, which is always the same, but never the same river. Right? Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, I certainly get your appreciation of very, very difficult books, right?
Yeah.
Did you try to inculcate that with your kids, or are there, when you read to them, did you read something a little bit lighter?
I read, well, my oldest, when my oldest was little, I was studying for my comprehensive exams for my PhD. So I read to him whatever I had to read for. So he was raised on Shakespeare, because that's what I was reading at the time, and Beowulf, right? Yeah, but my kids are all screwed up because of this. My daughter, I'm a linguist, and so one of the things I do is talk about word origins and stuff. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. So this is for free, by the way, the one I'm about to tell you. The word to bless, the English word to bless, comes from the root word for blood, because what you did in pre-Christian times is to bless the altar was to sacrifice the animal and then sprinkle the blood on the altar, right? And so that's where our word to bless comes from. So in my family, instead of saying bless you when someone sneezes, we say blood on you. And we make this gesture, right? And so my daughter, when she went to school, would say blood on you to her friends when they sneezed, and they thought she was crazy. They thought she was threatening them, or something. So that's what I mean. My kids are kind of screwed up. The other thing I noticed is, like, I would sometimes just make up stories for my kids. But if I had been reading a lot of Shakespeare that day for my exams, I noticed that I was speaking in a regular manner. I didn't even mean to. It's just like that's the rhythm I had in my head that day.
Any other questions? Jack, please.
Yeah.
So if I'm one of these people, and I am, that has not made it through, like just to forget it, you know?
Oh yeah. Chapter 11.
Somebody said to me one time, like, it's really the good of a PE professor to help you appreciate it, and, you know. But if we're too old for that, how do we do this? You already suggested, is there like a text with like a side commentary that says, you know, like, get through this page, you know, is there something like that?
There's a really good book called Ulysses Annotated, which which gives you the background from every single reference. But it makes reading the book really tedious. That makes the reading a lot longer. One of the bits of advice I always give my students is let his words just flow over you. You're not going to get it all the first time. So just plan on reading it again someday, or know that when you come to class, I'm going to kind of give you some guidelines for how to figure out what that experience you just had. But really, just letting it flow and not trying to catch every nuance the first time is my best. Yeah.
I do actually have a more serious question. So you talked a lot about how to appreciate all of those fine points, you really had to almost have this guide that he gave to this Italian professor.
Yeah.
Could you tell us, I mean, is there a way, what are the ways you see that a lay person can find the corollaries between Ulysses and Odysseus? Because next week we're going to be talking about Odysseus, the Odyssey, the Iliad, I think is going to sneak in there a little bit. But I mean, how can a lay person see the parallels between Ulysses and the Odyssey?
Oh, that's a really good question. In the book I just mentioned, Ulysses Annotated, they not only have a detailed explanation of every reference to the text, they also have, in the beginning of each chapter, they have exactly that. In the, let's say yeah, I don't have any of these up here.
I mean, I noticed in his annotations to the Italian Inquirer, he talked about the rocks, Silicaricus, the lotus eaters, and so forth.
Yeah.
But is that overt enough that a reader can pick up on?
I don't think so. I think that if you're very familiar with the Odyssey, then you might be able to see the parallels pretty easily. But what they'll usually say in the science chapter, Odysseus has gone here to this particular place. Here are the people that he encounters. There's one chapter called Cyclops. And so a lot of times the comparison between the two is pretty sketchy. Right? He's not trying to reproduce the Odyssey. But in the Cyclops chapter, you meet a character named the Citizen, who dominates the chapter, and he's a monomaniacal uber patriot. And so the connection with Cyclops is mostly the fact that he's only got one eye, so he can't see. He has no depth, essentially, right? He can only see one thing at a time. There are some other, at the very end, the Citizen, as Leopold Bloom is leaving a carriage, the Citizen comes out and throws a cigar tin at him. And the Cyclops throws a rock at him, the fleeing Odysseus. That's, right? So, I mean, very small connections. Some of them are much more connected to the Odyssey. It varies.
I have a suggestion. I think audiobooks are a good choice when the language trips your eye or you feel like you're not reading it well.
Yeah.
And so finding somebody, Hoopla, I will put a promotion in the library as Hoopla, and you can find James Joyce's books on audio. And you could go straight to that chapter and have someone read chapter 11 to you, and that might actually help you. Because I'm just saying, because sometimes I think the problem is when you're reading, and you're reading it and it feels broken up, and you're kind of like, I can't read this. But hearing someone read it to you is a very different experience. Like your ear can take it better, and plus on Google, you can speed it up. If you need, I mean, Google has. I'm just making a point that audiobooks give you that ability to, first of all, take it in, and I think Joyce lends itself to someone reading it to you.
Some Joyce does. I think, especially things like Dubliners, those are more conventional.
Right, but I still think like sometimes your ear can maybe take something that your eye, because we listen to some pretty out there music, but we don't necessarily read things in a disjointed way. So I'm just saying, like sometimes maybe you get through that chapter, you could try an audio version.
I wonder if they haven't. I wonder if anyone's tried to put that on. I know they've tried to make a couple of movies. Unless you do that available there.
I'm pretty sure it's
Well, thank you, because I think that's a great suggestion. We did a little bit of foreshadowing as a literary advice, and if you'll come back and join us next Tuesday, Dr. Kirsten Day will be leading us through a consideration of the Odyssey and its place, its claim to being one of the great novels, if not the greatest of all time. And then the week after that, we want you to come back because another colleague, Brett Beagle, is going to be talking about Mason and Dixon by Thomas Pynchon. When I've rattled off these names to friends, I think Pynchon is the least recognizable to many of the people I've spoken to, so hopefully we'll get a nice turnout for that. And then we'll wrap up the series on the second Tuesday in November with a consideration of Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, and kind of bring things back closer to home and the Midwest. So for now, I want to thank you all for being here. Thanks to the library, as ever, for the great hospitality. Thank you.